Hi, I'm Ashish, CEO of HireTalent and Consciously Unbiased. Consciously Unbiased is in the movement of building belonging in the workplace. Today, we have special guest Reid Blackman. He's CEO and founder of Virtue, a consultancy that helps companies guide on how to be ethically conscious. Sorry.
You can't even, if you can't say the word, we're gonna have trouble being.
Definitely. So we're in the business of belonging. You're in the business of ethics. I'm super excited to have you here. Can you share to listeners what it means to be ethically conscious?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, there's a way in which everyone sort of knows what it is to be ethically conscious. It's to have a sort of an understanding of the kinds of ethical requirements that you have of companies, organizations generally. Could be the government, but especially we're seeing tons of people, especially people of a younger generation, really care about the ethical standards of the companies that they work for and the companies they purchase from. Right. So the tagline for it is really putting people before profit.
Mm. Um, what trends are you seeing in terms of companies going remote and then the monitoring around that?
So there's, early on, everyone was getting all worked up about, justifiably so, about privacy invasions by government and big tech because they're collecting a tremendous amount of data in an effort to fight the virus. And that's fair enough. One of the things, though, that sort of frankly I knew was going to happen, and now there's been a lot of reporting on this, is that companies are, in some sense, reasonably really fearful that their employees who are working from home aren't actually doing so much working. And
Mm.
so what that leads to, and then you put that, you juxtapose that with a concern about shrinking top line revenue, which is revenue, bottom line revenue, your bottom line. And what you get is fear of wasting money and not capitalizing on all the opportunities that there are to make some money. And that fear is going to drive employers to monitor their employees to see what they're doing, to make sure that they're doing enough, doing what they should be doing. And if they're not, to get rid of them, because this is a time not to sort of have any fat. We got to trim all the fat. So as a result, they're ramping up monitoring efforts. If I wanted to put it in a slightly more I don't know, controversial or politically charged way, I'd say they're ramping up their surveillance efforts, and they're tracking things like how often you open particular apps. So whether it's, first of all, whether it's just broad categories, right? Social media, um, I don't know, Google searches, when you're in their app, when you're in their proprietary applications. They're also tracking to see whether you're active within those applications. So how often you click or type something within those applications. They're also breaking it down by particular, say, social media site. So are you in Facebook? Are you in LinkedIn? Are you in Instagram? It matters. Some of them are actually recording keyboard strokes, which is insane. It's everything that you type on the keyboard, they are keeping a log of it. Some of them are going so far as to do facial recognition analysis to see what you're looking at, what emotions you're displaying, or at least allegedly displaying. And so what we're seeing is, I think it was the Washington Post who wrote something about a week ago to say, the businesses that sell this kind of software, they're doing 3 times the business they were doing pre-pandemic. So this stuff is skyrocketing.
Mm. So do you think, how do you feel like companies should be balancing monitoring versus managing anxiety and keeping a culture of trust within your employee sector, but also sort of have productivity tracking?
Yeah. So, I mean, one approach is sort of ideal, and sort of feel like the ideal approach that no business is going, or that very few businesses will actually take on, which is just don't do any monitoring, just trust your employees, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Or look, I'm sort of I'm a bit more pragmatic than that, even as an ethicist, to say, all right, look, we know these companies are going to do this stuff, right? Companies they're just going to do it, and
Yeah.
in some sense, they're not radically unjustified in it. It's not crazy to think, hey, we're paying all these employees a lot of money, and our market has contracted. We need to make sure that people are working. That's sort of fair enough. So the question is, how do you do it in a way that can still respect people? And there's a bunch of things to do. One thing to do is to make sure. But here's a very general point.
Mm-hmm.
When people talk about monitoring software, surveillance software, you talk about surveillance generally. What you are typically thinking about, what you associate it with, is oppression and control. right? Like the surveillance state, fascist governments, they surveil their people. And so then you think about these corporations surveilling their employees, and the managers who are using this software are implicitly encouraged to think about it in terms of control, oppression, and punishment when people don't comply.
Mhm.
You don't have to think about it that way. A company could use the software in the following way. Hey, look, it's really hard to work from home. Schools are shut down. People have lost their childcare, whether it's daycare or nannies.
Mhm.
So, what we can use this tool as is a method to identify those people who need more help to be more productive. Because
Mhm.
by and large, people want to do the work. They certainly want to keep their jobs. And frankly, people, they want to be at work, they want to be productive, they want to accomplish things. And so more often than not, it's going to be better to approach them with a sort of outstretched hand than a raised baton.
Yeah,
So that's
and you wrote productivity, and it's interesting because I think our traditional ways of measuring productivity has been how long you've been at the work, what kind of tasks have you accomplished, like what are the hours you put in, right? And
yeah.
so I think between balancing your personal life and child education and getting work done, people are actually working longer hours. They're just kind of more sporadic in the times that they're doing. So you can't really use software necessarily to measure like the actual keyboard strokes that somebody's getting done because they may be doing work on off hours.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that's exactly right. I mean, I sort of think that one of the crucial things here is what are the metrics?
mhm.
And there's all sorts of ways of screwing up the metrics just generally, right? Just forget COVID, forget working from home, just people in their offices doing their thing. You can just choose sort of silly metrics like how many emails somebody sent, right? Like, who cares? Or how often they typed something. But again, if they're being more thoughtful about what they type and so they take longer, they think about it. I could say this, I could say that. Hey, Sarah, what do you think about this? Right? I think I should say this in the email, but there's things that you might do that are perfectly conducive to being productive and not just sort of churning out work for the sake of churning out work, but churning out quality work. So you
Yeah.
can choose the wrong metrics to begin with. Now you can really choose the wrong metrics because there are so many things that you're not aware of, so many contextual factors that matter. Like, to your point, there are kids at home that you have to take care of, so you get in work when you can, you do more work in the evening than you used to. So it's really crucial to engage the relevant stakeholders, that is to say, and engage the employees, especially those being monitored, about what the metrics are and why they are what they are, and to ask them for feedback on, hey, do you think these are the right metrics, or do you think we can do better than this?
Mhm. What are the legal and ethical implications of monitoring?
I mean, the ethical ones are sort of at least twofold. I mean, broadly speaking, it's likely it's going to erode trust, right? For the what companies have been doing the past several years is they've been really concerned about the employee experience, and the
Mhm.
reason they've cared about that is because they know that employees want to work for trustworthy companies, and of course, violations of trust is an ethical issue, and
Mhm.
for all they've done to build up that trust, hiring chief people officers, um, caring about employee experience, thinking carefully about parental leave policies, et cetera, they're at risk of violating that trust, which is motivated by their own fear of their bottom line. Again,
Mhm.
it's not a completely unreasonable fear. In fact, I think it's a totally reasonable fear. But you can't let reasonable fear necessarily run roughshod over all the things that you've done to create an ethically sound culture. The other thing, which is really in my mind a subset of ethics and really speaks to the mission of consciously unbiased, is it threatens to combat all of the D&I efforts that companies have put forth. Right,
Mhm.
so you care about diversity and inclusion, and you've rolled out a strategy in order to deal with that, or at least you've done lots of training. Hopefully, you've done something around this. But like, here's what's going to happen with the monitoring stuff. I'm sure here's what is happening now. The people who will be monitored the most are going to be the people with the least power within an organization. Right,
Mhm.
the least powerful get monitored, surveilled the most. Um, who are on average, the most powerless within an organization? People of color, right? For a variety of reasons. And so you're going to get disproportionate impact on people of color than you are on, say, white men.
Mhm. Um, what do you think are some of the guidelines we should be using for monitoring policies and being transparent?
Guidelines for
Monitoring techniques and policies, and also being transparent with your employee and what you're actually tracking.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is about you're, you know, there's three things here, right? There's the product itself, and what are the risks of using that product just by itself, because some of the features are really gnarly, like the sentiment analysis, which is also just based on BS science. We can talk about that if you want.
Right.
The second is how you deploy it, right? So how you actually use the software. And then the third and crucial part is what's your communication strategy around it. And that speaks to the point about transparency. So it's super important that companies are talking to their employees about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Hey, we're doing this, we're collecting this data. It will or it will not be used for decisions about who to fire or furlough or whatever, or who to promote or give a bonus to. Here are the metrics that we're looking at. Here are the numbers that matter. And if you're not going to use the data for things like firing, promotion, bonuses, et cetera, then that too should be clearly communicated to your employees to say, hey, we're collecting this data. Here's our purpose. We won't be using it for these kinds of things. Because employees will largely assume the worst. And if you're not doing the worst, then you should be sure to tell your employees, hey, we're not doing the worst. We're doing the best that we can to, on the one hand, ensure that, people are still coming to work, so to speak, and they're doing their jobs on the one hand. But on the other hand, we want to respect people's privacy. And if you don't communicate that, then you might unnecessarily be doing damage to the relationship.
So you're basically saying measure based on the productivity, based on the idea of trust rather than the opposite, right?
Look, it's, trust but verify in a way, right? So you have to take a look at what the metrics are. And I think that what the metrics are should be a conversation with the people that you'll be looking at, right? I mean, they might say, hey, look, you're looking at emails, but honestly, I do most of my work in LinkedIn messaging, right? Maybe that's just how you do most of your networking and your sales and your closing deals. You do it on LinkedIn messaging. Maybe, you do it on the phone, your personal phone, instead of a Zoom call or a phone conference or whatever, or a Google Hangout or whatever, right? So you might be tracking something that's just not relevant to the person or to the people whom you're tracking. So, and then, and you build trust by sort of, if you like, giving them the benefit of the doubt and being transparent about what it is that you're doing.
Yeah. There's also, you brought up sentiment tracking and stuff like that. So there are going to be a lot of software that claims they can do certain things and create productivity for you, but they're actually based on faulty science, and they're also just not the things you want to be doing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's, a lot of so I do a lot of work with artificial intelligence and the ethical risks of artificial intelligence, and a bunch of the ethical risks are themselves founded upon just total scientific negligence. So there's a bunch of software out there that does facial recognition, that does sentiment analysis. So sentiment analysis is, here are the emotions that you're feeling. It's based on this research by someone named Paul Ekman, who identified, I think it's 7 micro expressions. Joy, sadness, surprise, fear, disgust. I don't know, and a couple of others that I can't just rattle off off the top of my head so quickly. And the thought is supposed to be, if we can read your emotions, we can tell certain things about you. If we can read off your facial expressions, we can tell what your emotions are, and from there we can tell what your thoughts are, and then we can, behave or treat you accordingly. The sort of science around micro expressions is, as far as I can tell, legit. What you can read off those micro expressions, that is to say, for instance, whether somebody is lying or whether they really are happy or whatever, is completely fraud. There's not good research backing that up. In fact, there's lots of research that shows you can't, in fact, read off someone's microfacial expressions, whether they're lying or not, for instance. There's also tons of room for discrimination because your sentiment analysis can be fail to be, for instance, culturally sensitive and think, oh, the person's not being friendly because they're not smiling, when in fact they've been trained in their culture it's not polite to smile at those kinds of things, for instance. Or conversely, they're smiling like they should be smiling. That's a bad thing, but it's actually a nervous smile or an awkward smile, or they've been taught to, always appear friendly, right? So there are ways of using the sentiment analysis that completely ignore cultural variances, and so can easily discriminate against people from, just culturally varying groups.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then in terms of organizations, sort of like building out frameworks and DEIs or DI policies today, like I think we kind of jump in first without thinking through the overall goal, and then making sure that your ethics are aligned with what you actually want to build. Can you talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about D&I strategy in general, I think a lot of people just don't have a D&I strategy. I think that they think it's important, and so then they're like, okay, we're Starbucks and we just got in trouble. Let's shut down our stores and do implicit bias training, which is another instance of something that's scientifically questionable. Incidentally, that's just not me speaking. There's tons of research on this. If anyone wants to hear that, wants me to reference that research, I'm happy to send it to you. So they throw training, they throw compliance at people, around, say, don't sexually harass, which is true. You shouldn't. But that's not really a strategy. That's just a rule that you want to get people to follow. I think that companies really need to think clearly about what their D&I goals are and why they are what they are. Because if there's just sort of like, oh, this is what we're told to do, there's not going to be sufficient buy-in. There's not going to be a real strategy. There just won't be much at all. There'll just be talk. So my general view is that companies need to think about why diversity and inclusion is important to them, and what would constitute success. And then, just like any business goal you have, you've got to build strategy around it. You can't just, hope for things or just throw arbitrary tactics at it. It's got to be systematic. It has to be, the roadmap needs to be created with a clear view about what resources you have at your disposal and what resources you're willing to expend in pursuit of that goal. You have to see that there are multiple objectives you might want to achieve, and you can't achieve all of them at once, both due to time constraints and budgetary constraints. So you need to prioritize them. So until companies treat D&I goals as a kind of business goal that deserves the kind of strategic level thinking that it does deserve, that it needs, you're not going to see a lot of movement, I don't think.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? Is that what you're speaking to?
No, absolutely. Because I know you're doing a lot of research and consulting around this.
Yeah.
There are areas or places we can look to really get some scientific data around the ROI on diversity and inclusion. Because I think there's a lot of people doing this because they think it's the right reasons, but that doesn't really motivate organizations to do more than just talk about it, right? So we want to see real economic impact around it. And so is there data that they can look at to make the case for their organizations?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm an ethics consultant, right? Which is weird to begin with. Like, why would anyone buy ethics? And it's important that there's sort of two things here. Whenever you're talking about ethical issues, and I'm including in here diverse issues of diversity and inclusion, you need to be able to spell out the bottom line risk and opportunity, because there's both. When it comes to bottom line risk, when you discriminate against, say, women and people of color, you open yourself up to having low employee retention, and it's expensive to replace employees, to retrain them, to try to maintain institutional knowledge. You get workers who stay around to be less motivated than they would otherwise. You can get regulators investigating if you really screw up, or you can get lawsuits if you really screw up. You can face backlash on Glassdoor, on Twitter, or on Facebook, etc. So those are very real bottom line risks that hook up with D&I issues. Now, you might think, justifiably so, in my view, that D&I is important, if you like, for its own sake. It's a matter of, say, social justice. Perhaps it's a righting of past wrongs. But those things by themselves won't always, I would say very rarely, will by themselves move an organization to really take a strategic, committed approach to D&I. So there are those risks on the one hand. And by the way, in terms of research and numbers, a lot of the research comes out of, say, big consulting firms like Accenture or McKinsey, who are doing employee surveys, Deloitte, who are doing employee surveys and asking employees, hey, what are you looking for? What do you want? And so, when they say things like 40% of employees are looking to work for organizations that prioritize D&I, like, you've got to take that pretty seriously, because if you don't, the company next to you is, and they're going to get that hire that you want. And then there's just then there's similar research around capitalizing on innovation. Mm-hmm. So when you have a diverse array of people on your team, there's going to be new ideas, might help you formulate new products, might help you find new markets. And these are very conservative organizations that are putting research, maybe not very conservative, but let's say very business-minded organizations that are putting out research like this. So I'm including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Boston Consulting Group. They're all saying there's hard data. And again, for anyone who's interested in, I'm happy to send that data along to you. There's hard data that shows that companies that are more diverse and inclusive show a greater rate of return, capitalize on bigger markets, pay more out to their shareholders, and they're engaged in more innovation than those who are not committed to D&I.
Okay, great. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for being part of our LinkedIn Live session. If somebody wants to, how do they what's the best way to get to you?
Anyone's welcome to email me at reid@virtueconsultants.com. You can check out the website, virtueconsultants.com. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on Twitter at Reid Blackman. All those things.
All right. Thank you so much.
No, thanks, Ash. Great talking to you.
You too.
Take care.
Great. Bye-bye.